25 years ago today, Serb forces captured the Bosnian town of Srebrenica and carried out Europe's worst massacre since the Second World War. A ceremony is underway to remember the thousands of Muslims killed in the atrocity. The anniversary is being marked in the shadow of the global coronavirus pandemic, which has not only meant that commemorations have been scaled back, but has also again delayed appeals hearings in the trial of the main culprit. Serb General Ratko Mladic was eventually convicted of war crimes and genocide, but the families of the deceased are far from closure.
3 bones and a shred of cloth, and yet the revelation of a sad fate. One of 8,000 victims of the Srebrenica genocide is recovered here from a mass grave in eastern Bosnia. The bones are later brought together. Right here. Catherine Bomberger is the Director General of the International Commission on Missing Persons. She has been instrumental in finding and identifying the bodies of the disappeared. She cannot put the Srebrenica genocide behind her.
Yeah, in many ways, every day is 1995. We are eternally dealing with this issue now 20 years later.
Bomberger moved to The Hague from the Bosnian capital Sarajevo a few years ago. And this state-of-the-art lab where DNA is extracted from skeletal samples and analyzed came with her. The genetic codes can then be compared with the DNA of survivors. But this is not only about victims finding closure.
Not only that the bodies were found and allowing families to bury them, and in our case, using DNA to accurately identify them, but also ensuring justice for the victims. And that's been a road that we've embarked upon, but is not over yet.
The lab results have been used in various trials. In 2017, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia found the main perpetrator of the Srebrenica massacre, the former Serbian military commander Ratko Mladic, guilty of committing war crimes and genocide. He was sentenced to life in prison. On July 11, 1995, Mladic and his troops overran and occupied Srebrenica, where tens of thousands of Bosnian Muslims had sought safety. This is rarely shown footage from the Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. A Dutch battalion of UN Blue Helmets was supposed to defend the UN safe haven. But many soldiers looked on as Mladic had the men and boys rounded up. They were taken away and murdered in mass shootings, over 8,000. But there was more horror to come.
I mean, the perpetrators went back to the original mass grave sites, and to cover up the evidence, they used heavy machinery. They went back to the original sites and dug up bodies from primary locations and moved them to multiple secondary locations, often 50 kilometers away from each other.
The U.S. detected the genocide by analyzing satellite images. Victims had been buried across Serbian-controlled eastern Bosnia. Some skeletons were torn apart. Then, years later, under the eyes of the Bosnian Serb authorities, the dead were exhumed.
So this went back to the forensic pathologist who would then look at cause and manner of death, which was often difficult because heads would be missing. I mean, it wasn't always possible to see bullet wounds because often they were executed in the head if the head is missing. I mean, I'm getting into the gory details. But this required probably the most meticulous scientific effort ever conducted in a post-conflict situation, and specifically related to a genocide.
The aim is to allow family members to properly bury their deceased loved ones. Anthropologists are piecing together their human remains.
Because it's possible that this came from one individual and this came from a different individual.
A daunting task. Today, experts can rely on DNA analysis that make their work easier. Samples are extracted from the human remains, sometimes from a whole range of them. This has allowed the experts to more or less piece together skeletons of the deceased. By comparing these DNA samples with those of relatives, the once nameless victims regained their identity.
But that meant working with traumatized families of the missing to try to receive DNA samples from them and to match those samples to the post-mortem skeletal remains that were being found in mass graves.
What began in Srebrenica is now a widespread method for identifying victims. It's used the world over to identify those killed in wars and other conflicts.
And Srebrenica is a reminder of what we're all capable of, regardless of which country we're from. That level of hatred results, it can have a very, very bad ending, and I am scared.
Catherine Bomberger says it's up to us alone whether or not we learn from the past.
I'm now joined by Professor Haris Halilovic, a social anthropologist and award-winning writer at RMIT University, Melbourne, Australia. Halilovic has written about the long-term effects of the Bosnian War, but more importantly, sir, you are from Srebrenica and have relatives who were killed in the massacre there. What does this day mean for you?
Well, like to everyone who survived Srebrenica, this is the day most of us are conscious about for the whole of the year. It's not just a one-time-a-year event. For most of us, this is something we think about on a daily basis. Some are affected more than others, and I know that my aunties and my uncles and my cousins, for example, are much more directly affected than myself. I happened not to be in Srebrenica at the time of the genocide, and I left Srebrenica when I was, my early teenage years. However, as Catherine Bomberger described, finding a bone, getting identified, piecing all these pieces together has been a very ongoing process and for many very traumatic experience to go through. So it is a humble day of remembrance and day of reflection for all of us, as it should be for everyone else.
Understood. The war was fueled by nationalism. Some will say that nationalism is on the rise again in many parts of the world. Do you see any similarities to what is happening now and what happened back then before the war broke out?
Well, what is probably most disappointing is to see exactly that continuation of the old wartime nationalist rhetoric, and not only rhetoric, but also the policies and kind of the whole culture being infused by this type of nationalism that started before the war, in terms of dehumanizing other ethnic groups, in terms of justifying crimes that were to be committed or even those that were committed. In genocide studies, we have different stages of genocide, from dehumanization to perpetuation of actual physical killings to denial. What we have seen in post-war Bosnia and the region is going beyond the denial. It's actually a culture of triumphalism, where genocide is even justified, mocked, victims humiliated, and all this is not only allowed but also promoted from above by the hardcore nationalist elites, those in Serbia and in part of Bosnia Republika Srpska. They are especially active in that. And this has also penetrated down to ordinary people's lives with songs and jokes about genocide becoming almost a norm rather than a form of extremism. Yes, it's a very worrying trend.
Haris Halilovic, I just want to ask you, in 10 seconds, how do we make sure this doesn't ever happen again?
Well, the purpose of genocide studies is really prevention, learning from the past in order to prevent and recognize any potential risk for future genocides. We need to acknowledge what happened, but also we need to combat every other form of exclusion. And unfortunately, and sadly, we have seen those not only at the rhetorical level, but also in terrorist attacks in Norway and here in New Zealand.
Haris Halilovic, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. Professor for Global, Urban and Social Studies at RMIT University in Melbourne.